Despite evidence being in front of us, sometimes we just don't see the truth for a variety of reasons, or we're not willing to accept it. This is true in the history of medicine, it's true in the history of disease, in the past as well as the present. For example, a lot of people do not believe that COVID-19 is a real pandemic. They've questioned medical science. They've questioned the good advice that's being offered, for example, with respect to PPE, and this continues to prolong the problem that we have here. Here I want to take a look at the truth and how it's been manufactured in the past and what people were in fact willing to believe despite their eyes telling them something different. Let's move on to the next slide. In the 1500s, Dürer produced an image of a rhinoceros, and in doing so, he manufactured truth. What I think is interesting about this is the image was regarded as the true depiction of a rhino until the 18th century. And in fact, it was copied and reproduced despite the inaccuracies. Why? Why do you think people did that? Unless rhinos have changed drastically over the course of history since the 1500s and they lost their chainmail and they lost their armor. What was going on? I think on one level, Dürer was trying to convey that this rhino was like it was covered in armor, and the idea or the image was reproduced over time because students ultimately were mimicking the authority, the master Dürer, and they didn't move away from the way that he had depicted the accepted image of the time. Let's move to the next slide. In 1632, Rembrandt produced a painting that documented a dissection by Dr. Tulp. This is Arius Kin. He's a convicted criminal. He's being dissected, and there's a number of doctors or students watching this dissection. This is an important image because it documents a moment in time that people's attitudes towards the body were shifting. What do I mean by that? Well, while we like to think that perhaps people have dissected ever since the emergence of science, and we could take that back, say, to the ancient Greeks, that wouldn't be accurate. Dissecting humans, while this has occurred from time to time, it's been mostly taboo over the course of human history. In fact, there have only been a few opportunities every year, depending upon the country that you are in, that you could open up a corpse and study it. Let's move to the next slide. You don't need to copy all of this down, but just to give you an idea of when in the medieval period that dissection was legalized. So beginning in about 1200, 1207 in Normandy, dissection was permitted, and this was permitted on the grounds that you dissected a convicted criminal, a male, and it was done once a year at an institution that had been granted permission. So we see throughout time that this really doesn't change, and it gave people very few opportunities to look into the body. But I think what's striking about this is even though they were looking at the body and they ultimately saw something different than earlier scientific anatomical texts had said about the body, they didn't trust their eyes. Let's move to the next slide. Here we're looking at a proper dissection during the medieval period, and it looks a lot different than the image that Rembrandt had provided us. At the back of the image center, we see the individual who has permission to conduct this, the physician, the head physician. He's sitting in a bishop's cathedra. He's reading from a book. And as the surgeon in the foreground dissects this body, and this individual would be a criminal that's being dissected, the person in the cathedra, he's reading from ancient texts, and he's saying here you'll note, for example, the five-lobed liver, and everybody looks around, and they say, we don't see a five-lobed liver. Well, that makes sense, because humans don't have five-lobed livers. In fact, there were a number of issues or a number of problems that emerged as people dissected, but the interesting thing is, even though their eyes told them that the human liver didn't match what the ancients had said about the liver, they nonetheless trusted the ancients. So the attitude towards the body in the medieval period was humans, they're fallible. They can be wrong. Whereas the ancient authorities, they were seen as infallible, individuals that could not be wrong, and you didn't challenge what they had to say. So the ancient descriptions, they're ultimately trusted over more modern observations, ones that involve direct experience. Now, this doesn't mean that ancients didn't dissect. They did from time to time at various periods in history. For example, in ancient Alexandria, dissection was permitted. However, in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, dissection was not permitted. So, in fact, people discovered, according to them, that the body had all kinds of errors when compared to ancient textbooks. Now, like I said, humans are not perfect. We are fallible. And this is one of the ways that it was explained. In addition to that idea of a human being fallible, we have double fallibility here because they're dissecting a criminal. So he must be doubly fallible. So we're going to expect that there's issues with this body. Darn, they would think. We'll have to wait until next year to see a 5-lobed liver. It never came. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here is look at this image. Like I said, we have an individual, by and large, disinterested, sitting in that cathedra, reading from a book, orating on the body and the parts that they should be seeing. And those physicians that are studying the body during this dissection, they just don't look that interested to me. Think back to what Rembrandt had shown us. We'll come back to that image in a minute. Let's move on to the next slide. So medieval anatomy, and don't be surprised here, this is the very best, if you were studying medicine during the medieval period, this is the very best anatomical descriptions, depictions that people have, and they are not accurate. So if you look at both of these individuals, right and left, locate the liver. I know it's a little bit hard to do. The liver, we're going to find it on the right-hand side in the abdomen, and you can see clearly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lobes are depicted. That's the way they saw the body, because that's the way the masters had depicted it. Let's move on to the next slide. Coming back to Rembrandt, we see a very different picture here. The imagery is striking in comparison to the medieval dissection. Dr. Tulp in the fedora, he is not sitting in a cathedra. If we look in the foreground on the right-hand side of the screen, we see a book. It's outside of the picture. It's kind of framing what's going on. And the center point is the body. Everybody's looking over the body, looking into it for information, for insight. What had taken place here is, and there's a great contrast here with the body, trace it down, areas kin until we get to his feet, and then we can see the book. Ultimately, what's being said here is the body is the book. A little over 600 years ago, the Middle English word for dead body, corpse, was adapted from the Latin word for book, corpus. How fitting it is that both can be read. Now, this is no coincidence. This was a movement in the history of medicine where people started to trust their eyes, and they began to engage in autopsy, to see for oneself. Let's move on to the next slide. As science continues to develop and people have this thirst, this desire for knowledge, a need for bodies emerges, and people begin to challenge some of the laws and regulations regarding dissection. If you've ever wondered, is there any truth to legends like Jack the Ripper? Absolutely. This is a large part of the history of medicine during the 1700s, and then we start to see changes as we move into the 1800s. What had taken place is people started to challenge some of the old authorities, those books, and they saw the body as the book. A black market for bodies begins to emerge. For example, Dr. Knox, he pays 2 convicted murderers, Burke and Hare, to go out and murder individuals and bring those bodies back to him. Now, while some individuals were paying for fresh bodies, other individuals, for example, such as Vesalius in the 15 and the 1600s, he was stealing bodies from graves. So, as for Jack the Ripper, grave robbers, this is absolutely true. By the 1800s, this starts to see changes in laws regarding dissection. In England, for example, they begin to realize there's a problem. And one of the ways that we could tackle this or we can address this is allow people to donate their bodies to science. And within scientific institutions, universities, physicians will have access to those donated bodies. And they don't need to go out and steal them. Now, grave robbing, it really begins, at least as far as we know, with this individual by the name of Vesalius. Vesalius is often regarded as the father of modern anatomy. His work was absolutely amazing. Once we get to the Renaissance, we'll talk more about him. But his depictions of the body were radically different than what anybody was producing at that point of time. The realism that was there was unbelievable. And he systematically documented all of those errors that the ancient authorities had written down in their books. And he did get himself into some trouble for doing so. In fact, his teacher, Silvius, had petitioned the emperors to have Vesalius put to death because he was challenging the authorities. Imagine an educational system where your teachers could do that. That stinks. How do we know Vesalius was dissecting bodies? Well, he's a pretty interesting guy. He left clues in his books. Let's move on to the next slide and take a look. What we're looking at here are historated letters. A large I, for example, a large C, and behind them we can see sketches or woodcuts, etchings. And in that material behind that eye, we see a number of cherubs. They're not putting a body into the ground. They're taking a body out of the ground in the middle of the night. And what Vesalius was doing, and he was a smaller individual, I think he was making a connection here. He was saying, I'm like a cherub. And he actually thought that he was doing the work of God as well, that it was our obligation to understand God's greatest creation here. But he didn't have access to bodies more than once a year. And to really come through and prove what he thought about the body, he needed more. So on the right-hand side of the screen, we see not a coffin being put into the ground. They're taking the coffin out of the ground in the middle of the night. And I think it's interesting that nobody caught on. No one was looking close enough. Let's move on to the next slide. Here's an image of Vesalius, and we have, working from left to right, we have a crucifix. As pointed out, Vesalius thought that he was doing this in the name of God. It was his obligation to understand God's greatest creation fully. Now, he's, like I said, he's a physician. And while we often think that there's always been this chasm or this strife that exists between religion and science, that would also be a manufactured idea as well. A lot of scientists were highly religious individuals who were often directed, as we're going to see, by religion as well. There we have Vesalius, almost center point. Moving just a little bit further over, we can see his hand is on the corpse, the body. And again, a nice juxtaposition between the body and a book. Now, this is being conducted in the middle of the night. These individuals were taken from either the gallows where they had been previously hung. They were dug up, and he dragged these bodies back to his home in the middle of the night and either boiled off the decomposing flesh so he could study the bones, or he dissected them if they were fresh enough to study the anatomy. Now, as pointed out, great test question here would be true or false, for example, or multiple choice, that would have us inquire into the origins of that word corpus, or the connection between a body. So we want to be able to say that here the strongest connection that we're looking at is corpus from the ancient Latin, and Greece for book, which eventually transforms linguistically into the word corpse. Body. The body is the book. Okay, that's where we'll leave this. We'll pick up with an introduction to anthropology and the history of medicine and disease. All right, I'll see you next time. Take care.